Welcome back to the show. Our first guest is the first African-American woman to head an Episcopal seminary. She's a renowned faith leader and expert on the intersection of the Black church and racial justice issues, including COVID-19's disproportionate impact on the Black community, as well as criminal justice reform. She is currently writing a book that's titled Resurrected Hope, or I should say Resurrection Hope, a future where Black lives matter. Joining me to share more now is the Dean of Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and theologian in residence at Trinity Church Wall Street, the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. And Reverend Brown Douglas, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Pastor Jaime.
I'm glad to have you in this conversation. And as we talk really right now about where we are as a society, I think that your work and your writing really is paramount. And when we talk about COVID-19 and how it's really impacted the African-American community, and we're dealing with this Delta variant, share with me a little bit about your thoughts as to where you see things today.
Yeah, indeed, this question and this issue of COVID-19 and how persons, of course, began to say how COVID-19 revealed to many the inequities that were present in the African-American community and other communities of color. It only revealed that to those who weren't living with them, right? Who weren't on the underside of these. So what I like to say is that we saw the convergence of two pandemics. One was the health pandemic, and one was this ongoing, much ignored pandemic of white supremacy, white racism that indeed created social, cultural comorbidities in communities of color, nothing more than the comorbidity of poverty, which brings along with it inadequate housing, inadequate employment, inadequate health care, all of those things that indeed have left Black people disproportionately vulnerable to COVID-19. And we've seen that. We expect the same thing, obviously, with the Delta variant. And so what we need to do is to understand that the vaccination for the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 and its various variants are having and will have on the African-American community is not simply about a shot in the arm. We must do that, but it is about changing our systems and structures in such a way that we can begin to dismantle those very things that have left Black communities and other communities of color in what I call a culture of death, communities that breed death, not life. And if we weren't aware of that before, then COVID-19 has certainly made us aware of that.
And talking right now, one of the issues that seems to come rising to the forefront right now is the conversation about critical race theory. A lot of people had that on the back burner, but now we know the critical race theory becomes another targeted thing. We know that some areas of the United States are trying to remove our nation's history, trying to get rid of critical race theory from amongst the dialogue. And so I want to get your perspective on critical race theory. But first, what I want you to do, spend just a second giving some education to some of our viewers who may not even know what critical race theory is really all about.
Yes, thank you for that question, because critical race theory is so much in the news and everybody talking about critical race theory. Most of those talking about it have no clue what it is about. It is also not new, right? And so critical race theory has been around for a long time, even if it's not been called that. I like to at least say it's been around since the time, and probably before, when W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1903 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And what critical race theory tries to do is help us really to understand all of those intersecting realities, beginning with a racially defined nation that has prevented the nation from living into its vision of itself, its best vision of a democracy where there is freedom and justice for all. So what I like to say is that critical race theory begins to look critically at the way in which race has impacted the nation's ability to live into its vision of itself.
And as we look right now, that conversation continues to go forward. Some people are still in the state of denial when talking about this whole matter whatsoever. But give us your perspective on how we can really better define our nation's history and how do we change that? Because you're an educational institution, you're training graduate students and those who are entering into the world of church and ministry, and you want to be able to present a balanced platform. And we know that when it comes to talking about issues of race, it seems as though white theology and white supremacy still runs rampant, even in a place of theological education.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because what we have made normative is one particular gaze, one particular perspective on our history, on experience, on truth. And in so doing, what we have prevented ourselves from doing is, in fact, expanding our vision and expanding the possibilities for justice, expanding the opportunity to live into our democracy. And so it seems to me that critical race theory is that which is significant and essential to us ever living into our democratic vision. So now, what does that mean that we have to do? It seems to me, Pastor Jaime, that if we want to indeed figure out why there is a gap between who we are as a nation and who we want to be, where we are as a nation and where we want to be, between our democracy as we are and the democracy that we aspire to, then if we want to get there, then we need to at least begin to understand our democracy from the perspective of those people who have not enjoyed the justice and privileges of our democracy. And so it is because they are the ones who can most tell you what's wrong. Right. And they're the ones that when they begin to talk about justice, then we know we're on the road, as Martin Luther King said, borrowing from preacher Theodore Parker, then we at least know we're on the arc that bends toward justice. Because when we don't begin to engage from the perspective of those people on the underside of justice, then we too easily confuse justice with the privileges that come from an unjust society. We too easily confuse justice with white privileges in a system and structure that privileges those who are raised white.
Yeah. And so you take matters into your own hands, so to speak, because you're the author of a book that's coming out, and that's Resurrection Hope. And that really begins to speak to the issues, particularly of those in the African-American community, talking about how Black Lives Matter. Share with us a little bit about what was behind your writing of this book.
Yeah, thank you for that. This book is sort of an extension from a previous book that I wrote called Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. And in that book, you know, I affirmed the faith tradition that God is just and is on the side of particularly Black people as they fight for liberation and fight for freedom. And as Black people do that, they're fighting for the freedom of all. But, you know, when we came through this summer of COVID-19 and the way in which it was disproportionately impacting Black life, then with what seemed to be an upsurge of the virus of assaults, police assaults and other assaults on Black bodies, one begins to wonder whether or not Black lives will ever matter in this nation. And in fact, Pastor Jaime, it was my 28-year-old son who began to ask me those questions over and over again. And he said, "Mom, do you really ever believe Black lives will matter?" And then he said to me, "I understand what you write, that God is Black and Jesus, the Christ is Black, in terms of understanding them on the side of Black people as they struggle for freedom." But he said, "But that isn't doing us any good right now." And so this was my journey to try to understand in so many respects if my faith, I was more loyal to my faith than it was to me, right? Whether or not we could really begin to have hope in a reality and in a world and in a God where indeed Black lives would matter. So it's sort of coming from the crucifying realities of Black death and trying to find that resurrection hope that will indeed affirm Black life in a nation that lets Black people die.
Yeah. And when we talk about really that gospel, the Bible, I know that you come from the perspective of understanding that much of what is written in the Bible from Jesus Christ on talks about really dealing with issues of poverty, the poor, the disenfranchised, the blind, those who have needs. And that seems to carry out in American society. We have people who are consistently poor. We have people who are really homeless. We've got people with an education crisis. And these are things that are both secular and at the same time also spiritual. So share with us, as we are, in this community talking about we're returning back and we're going back to, our jobs. We're going back to church. We're going back to all the places. And a lot of people talk about returning to this normalcy. But the fact of the matter is, for African Americans and people in communities of color, what's normal hasn't always been fair and it hasn't always been just.
That's right. Yeah, precisely right. And, this pandemic and the convergence of, if we will, two pandemics should have provided us with the opportunity to begin to do something new. Pastor Jaime, I'm sure you're familiar with this term Kairos, sort of Kairos time. This term that we use and is in the biblical witness, where we talk about it as sort of the right time, but it's a time of opportunity, a time of chaos and crisis, but a time where we like to say theologically, where God is fully present, a time where we can begin to understand that we are being called to something new, something different, a new just future. That should be our new normal. This talk of returning to normalcy, a normalcy that was toxic, a normalcy that was not life-giving, a normalcy of crucifying realities. We can't talk about that. We have to begin to be guided by this more just future and not accountable to the present or to the past. And so in our return to normalcy, I think, this nation talks about doing a racial reckoning. Well, a real reckoning is about really trying to do something to change, to transform, if not dismantle, the systems, the structures, the ideology, the culture that is indeed brought us to this place where we have not created a society that is life-giving. And let me say one last thing, and then I'll shut up on this. That we talk about returning to our churches. Here's the thing. To call ourselves church is indeed aspirational, because this injustice has happened on our watch. And so we cannot even return as faith communities to the way in which we used to do things. What we learned during this time is that being church is about more than being inside a building. And so we've had to look at new ways to live into what it means to, in fact, be church and to serve those people on the underside, to be accountable not to this present reality, but accountable to a more just future, and begin to create a society that gets us there.
How do we do that as an educator and one who is responsible for instructing students and leading the way of not just instructing students, but also professors to be able to lead and guide and direct them in a way that really addresses where we are? Because I think the whole point of the education system is to help us to understand a little bit about history, but then also the context of how we're living today. And when we look at how so many people are living today, a lot of people don't embrace that context. And if you're from a community of color, we've been living this context for a long period of time, but yet and still it seems as though the issues go unaddressed. So help me understand a little bit more. How do you make people from where you are become more woke, and then not just at the same time more woke, but at the same time more active, because you can be woke and still not be active.
No, that's exactly right. But then you aren't woke, right? You're just sleepwalking.
You're woke, but you ain't awake. How about that?
Yeah, I like that. You're woke, but you ain't awake.
Right.
And really woke people are getting on my nerves a little bit because they aren't awake. But I think, this takes us, first of all, back to your first question about critical race theory, that we cannot expect, and borrowing from the words of legal scholar Richard Rothstein, we cannot expect the next generation to be better than our generation if we do not begin to tell the truth about our history and how we got here. Not only do we need to tell the truth about our history, but we need to tell the truth about our present realities. And again, we only can tell that truth if we understand it from the people who have been on the underside of the lies that we have told about ourselves. And so we really have to, I like to talk about being sort of proximate and really understanding the complex realities that have created this poverty and these situations of death. And so we in educational institutions, what I try to do and what we try to do is to help our students, if you will, to understand that they are learning not just for learning's sake. They are not just taking in knowledge, but indeed that the role, the luxury, it's a privilege, right? To be able to get an education and sit around all day and think. You have to have your basic needs taken care of in order to sit around and think. And so we try to help them to understand that they are accountable to those on the outside of the institution, and that it's not knowledge for knowledge's sake, but trying to begin to critically engage so that they in fact can take that back, even in the communities in which they find themselves, to begin to create different kind of conditions of living. And so we always try to make sure that they have this dialogue between that which they may be studying and that of which most people, the conditions into which most people live their lives.
Yeah.
But I tell you, it all boils down to having the daggone moral courage to tell the truth.
Right.
And when we do that, things change. And that's why people in this country don't want to tell the truth.
Right. Well, to paraphrase, that's like translating book knowledge into street knowledge and applying it. How about that?
That's right. And how about starting with street knowledge and starting with the questions? Not, you don't come with the questions in your head. Come with the questions of the people who are struggling just to survive and make it.
Yeah, I want to talk about that for a minute, because there are some people who are surviving to make it, and there's a lot of questions that still remain unanswered. I want to tackle this particular issue right here, because we have a whole lot of people, particularly in New York City, who are living, fortunately, through this eviction moratorium. And so many people lie in the balance, because once this eviction moratorium hits, from my perspective, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I feel as though that we will see a rise in homelessness. I think we'll see even a more rise in the need for services. And if this eviction moratorium when it ends, there will be more of a collapse. And I don't think that too many people are really talking about the potential fallout that will happen after this is over with.
Oh, no, I think you're exactly right. But I think we are going about this and looking at this in all the wrong way. First of all, we had an opportunity during the time and where there was a moratorium on evictions. We had an opportunity as a nation to begin to ask ourselves, why are people not able to afford a place to live? No one says, I want to live on the street. People aren't living in these kind of conditions because they desire to. It's because they do not have equal access and equitable opportunity to housing and to employment that will allow them to have the kind of decent, life-giving housing. Here's a statistic that I heard on the news a couple of weeks ago, and that is that there is no state in this country where a person can rent a one-bedroom apartment if they are making minimum wage. And yet we won't even raise minimum wage. And
Right.
so we have not created the conditions for people to live. And so eviction moratorium, we need a moratorium on the conditions and systems and structures that have forced people into these kind of situations where they are living on the edge of being homeless. So yes, we're going to see an increase in homelessness. And more people on the street. And you know what that means? That means more kids on the street because there's more families. And we know that that's the case in a place like New York. To the number of families that each night find themselves in a homeless situation. And so an eviction moratorium, we need to have a moratorium on not allowing people the opportunity to have decent housing. And I don't know, well, I do know why this country during this period didn't take the opportunity to say that this is inhumane. There should be no one in this country that cannot afford a decent place to live. And so now we have this, we're going to lift the eviction moratorium. And what does that mean? We're going to wipe our hands of it and say the crisis is over. And we're just going to turn these people back out onto the streets. And we know that the people that are mostly impacted by this are, of course, disproportionately people of color, but more than that. And so it's all that you say is right. This is where faith communities and other religious communities and other activist communities have to raise their voices and have to protest until we don't have a need for eviction moratoriums, because we don't have a need for evictions.
Yeah. We talk about protests. One of the people that come to mind is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the fact that he led these protests when it talks about voting rights. And when we talk about the issues of King's Day, voting rights, unemployment, housing, income, these were the conversations that were had by King in the 60s. We're now in the year 2021. And in the year 2021, we're talking about voting rights, unemployment, jobs, housing. How distasteful is it that 50 years plus after the assassination of Dr. King, that we're still having these same conversations?
Yeah, see, you know, it's like the COVID virus. If you don't get to the root of the virus and the cause of the virus, then all it does is transform itself and change. And it usually is a stronger variant. We're back to the same thing here, telling the truth.
Right.
And we have this country, in as much, you see, as it has a vision of being a place where there's freedom and justice for all, where everyone can pursue life, liberty, and happiness. That was its vision. And it's a miracle that that vision emerged, though it was quickly compromised by its very foundation. And the country needs to understand and tell the truth about this. The way we are is the way in which we set our nation up to be, the way the founding fathers set it up to be. It is a nation that is founded upon a framework that is a raced framework. It is founded upon an elitist framework, a classist framework. And so until we began to understand that, the race capitalistic model of this nation, well, things aren't going to change. And so, and that's what critical race theory and all those are trying to help us to understand. It's not about being un-American, it's about being most American. If being American is living into the vision that of our better angels, as Abraham Lincoln would say. So we have to decide what kind of nation we want to be. The nation of this vision that was fleeting, but it was there. Mm-hmm. Or this nation of our founding fathers and those early Pilgrims and Puritans who indeed were trying to create what they called then this Anglo-Saxon exceptionalist nation. Now, what do we want to be? And so we are at this critical moment, and we'll see. The answer to that question has not yet arrived, has it? Or maybe it has. We'll see. But here we are 58 years later after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It's coming up in a few days from at least this recording on the 28th of August. And King's dream is nowhere near reality. And so there's still a promissory note, as he said, that the nation owes its people of color and more.
Yeah. Before we go, I want to have an opportunity for our viewers to be able to put their hands on your books and your writings. How can they be able to do that?
Oh, thank you for that. Well, easiest access is through Amazon.com, and in which they can find my books, and the forthcoming book will be out in a month or so.
All righty. Well, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, we thank you so much for joining us and being with us here on our show, and we definitely appreciate the conversation.
Well, thank you.
All righty. Well, we want to take a quick break. We're going to continue the conversation. Don't go anywhere. We've got more here on the Social Justice Forums.